This talk covers the tragic cruise pedestrian dragging mishap in which a robotaxi was involved in a complex mishap scenario that ultimately led to the severe injury of a pedestrian. As an overview of the talk and the mishap, in San Francisco on October 2023, a complex crash scenario took place. We're going to talk about that scenario, which involved a human-driven Nissan vehicle striking a pedestrian, throwing that pedestrian into the path of an oncoming cruise robotaxi. The cruise robotaxi stopping, but then starting again, resulting in the end in severe injury to the pedestrian. We'll talk about the mishap sequence, post-mishap response, and regulatory response, mentioning both things that Cruise did well and things that went wrong or could have been done better. There'll be some observations and some lessons learned. There's a more detailed treatment that can be found in an accompanying paper available at this preprint server. The data sources used for this presentation come primarily from an external investigation paid for by Cruise that involved a lawyer team as well as a technical expert team to review what happened surrounding the crash and the details of the crash. It was called a root cause analysis, but it's important to remember two things. The first is that Cruise funded these efforts, so it is reasonable to assume that the reports reflect the best possible conclusions most favorable to Cruise given the facts. And the second is that safety improvement recommendations were explicitly out of scope for both reports. To establish the context for the mishap, it's important to consider what was happening on the streets of San Francisco in 2023. Cruise, who is the maker of the robotaxi involved in the mishap, was busy marketing to the public on being safer than human drivers. They took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying that humans are terrible drivers, with the clear implication being that a robotaxi would be much safer because robotaxis don't make human mistakes. And they published some data based on a comparison of at-fault crashes, which claimed significant safety improvements from their robotaxi technology. Both of these publications were controversial. There are two sides to this story, but the point is that Cruise was aggressively marketing that they would be safer than human drivers. Meanwhile, on the streets of San Francisco, the news media was reporting a somewhat different situation. In March 2023, a software defect caused a Cruise robotaxi to crash into the back of a city bus. There were no extenuating circumstances. It was simply that the Cruise robotaxi had not been trained to handle buses with a pivot joint in the middle of the bus properly, and it crashed into a bus that it had seen. It was a straight-up software defect. By July, there were reports of mass strandings of robotaxis that would get stuck in the street, and you can see many Cruise robotaxis all stuck on the same street at the same time in this story. It's only one of many, which really annoyed the citizens of San Francisco because it was clogging up the streets. The public sentiment started turning against Cruise because of the inconveniences presented. In August 2023, Cruise was first granted permission to expand its operations, but about a week later had a crash with a fire truck. In this case, the Cruise vehicle was proceeding through a green light. However, the fire truck had its lights, sirens, and other annunciators active, responding to a fire. It was supposed to have right-of-way even though the light was red, but the Cruise vehicle failed to yield and a collision resulted. As a result of that, California Department of Motor Vehicles requested that Cruise cut its active fleet size in half. So for practical purposes, in August 2023, Cruise was put on probation by regulators and was performing much more careful deployments for a while after that. All this sets up context for the mishap, which happened October 2nd, 2023 at approximately 9:30 p.m. Walking through the mishap, the first step is that there is a red light in the direction of the Cruise robotaxi. It's at the bottom of the figure here. There's a human-driven Nissan vehicle in the left lane. There's a Cruise robotaxi in the curb right lane. They have a red light. They're waiting for the light to change. Meanwhile, a pedestrian on a crosswalk parallel to their lane of travel is walking across the crosswalk with a do not walk. There's no cross traffic, so nothing bad happens, but here is a pedestrian that is obviously willing to disobey do not walk signs. The next thing that happens is that the light changes green. granting the Nissan and Cruise robotaxi both permission to proceed. About this time, the pedestrian is reaching the far side of the crosswalk. The vehicles start moving, as is appropriate when they have a green light. And then the pedestrian starts crossing in front of the two vehicles. By the time the pedestrian gets to the second lane in front of the Nissan, oncoming traffic from the other direction has blocked her progress. So now she's stuck in the crosswalk. She can't go forward. She's distracted looking at other traffic, looking for a path to continue while the Nissan is coming towards her. The Nissan does not brake, striking the pedestrian. The Nissan vehicle brakes quickly, and as part of that interaction, the pedestrian is thrown into the Cruise robotaxi's lane. So we have a pedestrian that's been thrown from the Nissan vehicle into the Cruise robotaxi's lane. The Cruise robotaxi begins decelerating quite late, we'll revisit this, and strikes the pedestrian on the front left side of the vehicle. The robotaxi very quickly stops, but most of the braking happens after the impact. The Nissan vehicle, meanwhile, takes off, and the driver of that vehicle has not been apprehended that we know of. The robotaxi, after momentarily coming to a stop, starts a pullover maneuver that attempts to pull to the side of the road and drags the pedestrian underneath the vehicle. The pedestrian is dragged about 20 feet, suffers severe injuries, and in the end, the pedestrian accepts a settlement valued at more than $8 million. First, let's look at what went right and where Cruise succeeded in various aspects of this mishap. The Cruise vehicle tracked the pedestrian before the initial Nissan impact. So the Cruise vehicle saw the pedestrian cross the crosswalk parallel to the vehicle, turn, leave the curb, and start crossing across the road. So that part of the system was working. When the pedestrian was thrown in front of the Cruise robotaxi, it had trouble tracking the pedestrian. We'll get back to that. But when the pedestrian entered the robotaxi's travel lane, it saw that something was there. It wasn't sure what, but it saw something was there. And it correctly decided that I'm not sure what it is, but there's something there. So I will assume it's a pedestrian and I will stop. So the robotaxi did start braking based on recognizing some unoccupied space in its own lane. Once the robotaxi started the pullover maneuver, which was dragging the pedestrian, it recognized that something was obstructing its progress, so it stopped the pullover maneuver much more quickly than it might have otherwise. So it did recognize there was some sort of obstruction under it and came to a stop more quickly, which is a good thing because that likely reduced the amount of injury compared to what might have happened. But there are a number of things that did not go well. The first thing is that the robotaxi accelerated into a pedestrian in a crosswalk. During the time that the pedestrian spent a couple seconds walking in front of the robotaxi, it accelerated from 5.5 miles an hour to 13.5 miles an hour. The rationale for this acceleration is that the robotaxi predicted the pedestrian would be out of the way by the time the robotaxi got to it. However, there's a safety issue. If the pedestrian had stopped walking, had fallen, had stopped to pick something up, you would have had an accelerating robotaxi that now had to change its plan and stop because the pedestrian's trajectory has changed. This is so dangerous that there's a California Vehicle Code rule that says cars are expected to reduce their speed when they're approaching a pedestrian in a crosswalk. This rule does not say anything about whether there's a do not walk sign. You are required to reduce speed approaching a pedestrian or otherwise ensure their safety. Now, a police officer might come by and give that pedestrian a ticket for jaywalking, but that's a separate matter. If there's a pedestrian in a crosswalk, you're supposed to slow down because of the risk inherent in that situation, and the Cruise robotaxi was not programmed to behave this way. The next issue is that the Cruise robotaxi did not have any notion of the idea of a pedestrian being hit by some other vehicle other than itself. So the Cruise computer driver saw the Nissan pedestrian impact. In fact, it saw the trajectory of the pedestrian as she was walking across the street. It saw the trajectory of the Nissan. And if those trajectories are plotted out, it's clear they intersect. But the computer driver in the robotaxi did not have any notion that intersecting trajectories of other road users was any particular problem. In fact, the robotaxi's camera saw the moment of collision, but did not recognize it for what it was. It just lost track of the pedestrian because it didn't understand what was going on. So the robotaxi world model did not understand the significance of a collision between a pedestrian and some other vehicle. That's a problem for safety because there was a missed opportunity here. If the robotaxi had realized a pedestrian was being hit, it could have initiated a slowdown much sooner than it did. After the pedestrian was hit by the human-driven Nissan, the Cruise robotaxi lost track. Starting at the time of impact, there was intermittent classification as a pedestrian and intermittent tracking. Basically, it lost track of the pedestrian and never got a clean track on the pedestrian again during the rest of the mishap sequence. This could well have been that it was simply never trained on what a pedestrian would look like after impact with another vehicle. However, this is a lost opportunity. There were 2.9 seconds between the time the pedestrian was initially struck by the Nissan and the time the pedestrian was later struck by the robotaxi. At less than 20 miles per hour, that's plenty of time for the robotaxi to have slowed down and then come to a stop well clear of the mishap area. But because the robotaxi did not understand what was happening, it kept a steady speed for a while and then even slightly accelerated. Even if we restrict ourselves to considering the time the pedestrian entered the robotaxi's own lane, at which point a collision was guaranteed, the robotaxi had enough time to come to a full stop. Not a lot of extra time, but if it had stopped the instant the pedestrian entered its own lane, the robotaxi would not have hit the pedestrian, even accounting for delays applying brakes and all the other factors. However, for reasons not explained in the report, the braking was delayed by a considerable fraction of a second, to the point that the robotaxi did apply brakes before collision, but only managed to lose half a mile an hour of speed before the collision. Significant braking did happen, but did not happen until after impact. After the robotaxi had come to a stop, there was an issue that it, for practical purposes, forgot it had hit a pedestrian. That sounds kind of odd, but it's a complex situation, as many crashes are. The Cruise robotaxi had seen occupied space in front of the vehicle and had been programmed to assume that was a pedestrian, but that's not the same as actually having detected and tracked the pedestrian that was really there. It came to a stop, but it did not wait for remote assistance. The robotaxi was stopped for about 1/20th of a second before it started a pullover maneuver. Now, the robotaxi video shows the pedestrian on the robotaxi hood. However, the logic in the vehicle incorrectly evaluated this as a side impact based on unreliable tracking data. And apparently the vehicle had been programmed that if there's a front impact, it should remain stationary, but if there's a side impact, it should execute a pullover maneuver to the side of the road, which is what it did. This can be thought of as having inconsistent safety policies. Occupied space in the front of the vehicle was assumed to be a pedestrian, but a side impact was assumed to be, presumably, a sideswipe from another vehicle or something that did not involve a pedestrian down on the pavement at risk of further harm. After the collision, the pedestrian went under the left front wheel of the vehicle and was in the vicinity of the left front part of the vehicle when the vehicle came to a stop. There was no direct sensor designed to detect a pedestrian underneath the vehicle. However, the pedestrian legs were in view of the camera throughout the dragging. So the camera saw the legs, but the vehicle did not understand what it was seeing and did not detect the legs for any sustained amount of time. There was also vertical motion, basically the camera being bumped up and down as the vehicle ran over the pedestrian, and wheel slip indicating the wheels were spinning on something underneath the vehicle. Those symptoms were described in the report by Exponent, but were not recognized for the signs they were of an entrapped pedestrian at the time by the vehicle software. There's been speculation after the crash that robotaxis need to have under-vehicle sensors in case a pedestrian is run over by them. That sounds like a good idea, but it's important to note that there was ample sensor data in this case that the robotaxi could have known there was a pedestrian under the vehicle, especially because the pedestrian legs were sticking out from the side of the vehicle, but it did not recognize what was happening at the time. Now that we've gone through the mishap sequence, let's talk about what happened after the mishap, and we'll break this into two pieces. One is post-crash, so the evening of the crash, and the other is what happened in the subsequent days and weeks. What went right post-crash is that the car opened a remote assistance channel. There were contractors in Arizona that within seconds were connected to the car and saw a video of the crash. The remote operators saw that something very bad had happened by observing the crash video. Later on, when emergency services arrived, on-scene voice communications via the vehicle worked and the remote assistance operators were able to immobilize the vehicle as requested by emergency responders. Also, an engineering crisis team formed very quickly, and the various folks who needed to intervene were assembled quickly. In the following days, a number of things went right with the regulatory response. The box here with the acronyms talks about all the regulators and other governmental stakeholders involved. There's NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which operates at the U.S. federal level. There's the California Department of Motor Vehicles at the state level, who regulates vehicle safety. There's the California Public Utilities Commission at the state level, who regulates taxi operations. And there's the San Francisco city government, who has no regulatory authority over robotaxis, but had a vested interest in safety on the streets. Cruise established an internally messaging strategy and made sure their folks conformed to that. They held immediate meetings the next day with regulatory stakeholders, and they held some interviews with the press. So these are all things that Cruise got right and did according to plan. But there are a number of things that did not go as well. Right after the crash, a post-crash tactical issue was that Cruise and its contractors did not call emergency services, which in the U.S. is called E911, phone number 911. A bystander who saw the crash happened to call emergency services, but if that had not happened, it's unclear when, if ever, Cruise would have called emergency responders. Cruise got lucky on this one, and so did the Pedestrian, but it might have turned out much differently. The external review reports indicate that there was poor coordination of operations and the crisis team. The remote assistance team knew of the dragging very quickly after the event. On-scene support, who arrived after the emergency responders, had very good reason to believe a dragging had occurred based on blood and skin patches on the pavement behind the vehicle. However, engineering and corporate emergency teams said that they did not know a dragging had happened for up to 6 hours later, and only found this out when they downloaded logs and reviewed the logs from the vehicle. In response to this crash, there was immediate and dramatic media coverage, as one might expect. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a headline, "Woman Run Over by Autonomous Vehicle in San Francisco," which we know is not the whole story at this point, but at the time, that was the headline that people were seeing. And notice that this story was published less than an hour after the crash had happened. There was another later news story about driverless car runs over woman after crash. The media coverage, in part due to all the problems and antagonistic relationship between Cruise and the population, was very unfavorable at first. Cruise responded to this by having a media outreach trying to tell their side of the story, but they swung the pendulum the other way. The next morning, there was a story saying Cruise says a hit and run launched Pedestrian in front of one of its robotaxis. Their narrative here is that another car hit and run driver threw this pedestrian in front of our robotaxi, implying there's nothing we could possibly have done. It's all the human driver's fault, apparently trying to communicate that they were blameless and it just wasn't their fault. A bad thing had happened. This got enough traction that by the next morning, the San Francisco Chronicle had changed its headline to "Driver Hits Woman in San Francisco, then Cruise Runs Her Over, Photo Shows Victim Trapped." And if you go to that URL, you can see crash scenes, but that I will not reproduce here. What's missing from this media coverage is the dragging. This is all about the initial crash. Cruise made a conscious decision to withhold information about the dragging from the press. This withholding of the dragging was part of their effort to control their narrative. They wanted to focus blame on the human Nissan driver who not only hit the pedestrian first, but was also a hit and run, having fled the scene. And they decided to withhold the dragging part of the mishap from the press on the theory that they did not have an obligation of full disclosure to the public. When they spoke to regulators the next morning, they had an explicit strategy of let the video speak for itself. It turns out there were video playback issues, and the regulators might or might not have seen the whole video. Be that as it may, the regulators did not notice the dragging portion of the mishap. The regulators left a series of online meetings with the impression that, indeed, the human driver in the Nissan had hit the woman first. The woman had been thrown in front of the Cruise robotaxi. The Cruise robotaxi had braked dramatically, and that was the primary source of the injuries. What they did not notice was the dragging portion of the mishap, which arguably caused far worse injuries to the pedestrian. The Cruise team was told to take an approach of, if the regulators do not ask a question, do not volunteer information. So by the end of the meetings, the regulators did not realize that the dragging had happened, and the Cruise response was that they had dodged a bullet by not having to disclose this unfavorable information. In short, they had ineffective messaging of the bad news, and when later reporting happened, they chose not to correct overly favorable reporting. Eventually, the regulators figured out the dragging had happened, and that blew back in a big way. By 3 weeks after the crash, California DMV had realized that they had been misled, whether intentionally or unintentionally is controversial, and revoked their Cruise operating permits. The dragging sequence was made public, and the headlines were now, Cruise hid video of woman being dragged along San Francisco streets. Whether or not the DMV saw the video and did not recognize it for what it was, or was not shown the appropriate part of the video, or whatever, is controversial. However, it is very clear that Cruise did intentionally hide the dragging from the public. The backlash was severe. There are some safety culture observations related to this. Cruise was under tremendous funding and market pressure to deploy quickly. They had an aggressive scale-up strategy. There were numerous incidents leading up to the October mishap involving a fire truck crash, which we've mentioned, clogged streets, which we've mentioned, dozens of instances of interfering with emergency response teams, to the point that the San Francisco fire chief was said to be fed up with robotaxis that mess with their fire trucks. So there's a really antagonistic relationship with the city government as well as the residents of the city. There was a tactical issue versus hazard mitigation trade-off that was driven by this. Why did the Cruise robotaxi wait 1/20th of a second before starting to move again, even though it had just had a collision? An obvious reason for this is that they were tired of being in the news for clogging up streets, and there was logic programmed in that they thought was sufficient to have the robotaxi move itself out of the way while waiting for remote assistance so as not to clog traffic. In this case, that went tragically wrong because their logic got wrong the fact that there was a pedestrian underneath the vehicle. From a safety culture point of view, I would say this also indicates insufficient respect for rare events. Things like a pedestrian being hit by one car and thrown into another lane do happen. They're rare, but they definitely happen. But in response to the mishap, Cruise employees were quoted as saying that that scenario was unrealistic and an insane hypothetical. Those are actual quotes, indicating that no one should have expected their vehicle to be able to handle that kind of situation, which in fact is pretty foreseeable. By the time that dust had settled, Cruise had eliminated 24% of their workforce and fired all the top decision makers. There are new decision makers in place. There's a lot more oversight from their parent company, General Motors. And there are some high-level takeaways. The first one is that off-nominal, rare situations matter. Robotaxis will get involved as secondary participants in mishaps. That's unavoidable if you're on a public street. And if you're not good at anticipating them and trying not to be nearby when something bad happens, you'll get caught up in it. There are unusual presentations of road users. Yes, pedestrians will eventually be thrown from one car. Pedestrians will fall off curbs. Pedestrians will trip and fall down. And all those things cannot be ignored if you want to get pedestrian safety right. And in general, post-mishap situations are complex. The normal assumptions of how people behave on a road are not going to hold after a crash has occurred. Another high-level issue is that lack of transparency degrades trust. Cruise had a very adversarial relationship with the city of San Francisco. In particular, The California Public Utilities Commission hearing right before they were granted expanded permission in August 2023 was extremely contentious, with many hours of testimony on both sides from the public. A takeaway here, though, is that the alleged cover-up is always worse than whatever happened. The fact that crews tried to downplay and hide from the public the dragging portion really blew up later. Related, the optics and substance of taking safety seriously matter. Crews did not do a safety stand-down after the pedestrian dragging. They decided to continue operations. This hurt them from a technical point of view by having a missed opportunity to reflect on safety and improve it. But it also hurt the optics with the public and regulators by making it seem they did not take the grievous injuries done to this poor woman all that seriously. As we know, safety culture matters. It's not only the engineering safety culture that matters, but also the integrity and capability of the operational support for what happens after a mishap occurs. There's also tremendous economic pressure to deploy, and that also puts pressure on safety culture. Now that we're into summer and going into fall 2024, Cruise has new management in place. They've resumed supervised autonomous driving with safety drivers, and presumably at some point they'll remove their safety drivers. As far as safety, we'll just have to see how this plays out.